Long before tanks crossed borders, the war began in ideas. Adolf Hitler did not invent expansionism, but he transformed it into doctrine. After the First World War, Germany was humiliated, territorially reduced, economically unstable, politically fractured. For many nationalists, defeat demanded explanation. Hitler offered one. He believed history was not shaped by diplomacy or compromise. It was shaped by struggle. In his worldview, nations were not political entities. They were biological organisms. They either grew or they died. This belief was rooted in a distorted interpretation of social Darwinism. The idea that races and nations competed for survival. To Hitler, Germany had been weakened by internal division and external enemies. Only expansion could restore vitality. Territory meant strength. Population meant power. Land meant survival. He rejected the post-war borders of Europe as artificial and unjust. He saw them not as legal settlements, but as temporary obstacles. National greatness, in his view, required space. Not colonial space overseas, not distant empires, but land in Europe. Expansion eastward was not simply strategic. It was ideological. It was framed as destiny. By the early 1920s, this belief was already central to his speeches and writings. The concept was simple. Germany must expand or disappear. This was not yet a military plan. It was a worldview, and it would shape everything that followed. The word was simple: Lebensraum, living space. But behind it lay one of the most dangerous ideas in modern history. Hitler argued that Germany faced a demographic crisis. Its population was growing. Its territory, he claimed, was too small. He rejected overseas colonial empires as outdated. Germany did not need distant lands across oceans. It needed space in Europe. To him, land was not merely geography, it was survival. He framed expansion as a biological necessity. Just as organisms compete for resources, nations must compete for territory. Peaceful coexistence, he believed, was an illusion. Stronger nations expanded. Weaker nations disappeared. Lebensraum was presented as destiny. Germany, he argued, had the right, even the duty, to secure fertile land in the East. The plains of Eastern Europe were described as underutilized and ripe for transformation. But this was not simply economic ambition. It was ideological conquest. The people already living there were not seen as equals. They were obstacles. In speeches and writings, the concept was repeated again and again. Germany must expand eastward, not tomorrow, eventually, strategically, inevitably. By the 1930s, Lebensraum was no longer abstract theory. It had become national policy. It shaped military planning. It shaped diplomacy. It shaped propaganda. Lebensraum was not a slogan. It was a blueprint. Lebensraum was not a vague dream. It had direction. East. From the beginning, Hitler's expansionist vision focused on Eastern Europe. Poland stood directly in the path. To the south and east lay Ukraine, vast, fertile, and agriculturally rich. Beyond that stretched the immense territory of the Soviet Union. These lands were not randomly chosen. They were strategic. Eastern Europe offered farmland capable of feeding millions. It provided access to raw materials, oil, and industry. It offered space for settlement, but geography was only part of the calculation. Ideology shaped the map. In Nazi racial theory, Slavic populations were considered inferior. Their lands were portrayed as underdeveloped, their governments as weak. This narrative justified aggression. Poland was seen as an artificial state created by the Treaty of Versailles. its independence was viewed as temporary. Ukraine was described as Europe's breadbasket, a resource base waiting to be controlled. The Soviet Union was portrayed as both ideological enemy and territorial prize. Military planners began studying rail networks. Supply routes were analyzed. Terrain was mapped in detail. Long before 1939, the Eastern question dominated strategic thinking in Berlin. The goal was not influence, it was transformation. Borders would be erased, populations displaced. The region reorganized under German authority. Eastern Europe was not merely adjacent territory. It was the future battlefield, and eventually, it would become the center of the largest invasion in human history. Territory was only part of the plan. The deeper objective was transformation. At the heart of Nazi ideology stood the belief in racial hierarchy. Humanity, they argued, was divided into categories of value. Some were destined to rule, others were destined to serve or disappear. This worldview shaped every strategic decision. Expansion eastward was not simply conquest, it was reorganization. The lands of Eastern Europe were envisioned as future German settlement zones. Cities would be redesigned, borders erased, populations reshaped. Millions were classified as inferior in Nazi racial doctrine. Policies were drafted long before the war began. They outlined forced displacement, labor exploitation, and demographic engineering. This was called the New Order. It promised stability through domination, prosperity through control, unity through uniformity. In Berlin, planners discussed long-term colonization. Agricultural estates were imagined. German families would be relocated eastward. Existing populations would be reduced, relocated, or subordinated. The war, in this vision, was not temporary. It was structural. The objective was not to defeat an army alone. It was to redesign an entire region. Racial theory gave expansion moral justification within the regime. It transformed aggression into mission. By the late 1930s, this vision was no longer abstract rhetoric. It had become administrative policy. The Eastern Campaign would not only redraw borders, it would attempt to redraw society itself. Ideology alone does not fuel armies. Resources do. Behind the rhetoric of destiny and racial hierarchy lay a practical concern: survival through economic strength. Germany in the 1930s was industrially powerful, but resource limited. It depended on imported oil, imported grain, imported raw materials. In a prolonged war, dependence meant vulnerability. The solution, in Nazi strategic thinking, was self-sufficiency, and self-sufficiency required land. Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine, was viewed as the agricultural heartland of the continent. Its vast wheat fields could feed millions. Control of this region would secure food supplies not only for soldiers, but for the German population at home. Beyond agriculture, expansion promised access to coal, iron, and eventually oil fields deeper in the east. Economic planning and military planning became intertwined. Factories expanded production of tanks and aircraft. Rail networks were studied for supply routes. Resource extraction was calculated alongside troop movements. The goal was autarky, a war economy independent of global trade. This was not merely conquest for prestige, it was conquest for sustainability. War would demand steel, fuel, and grain. The Eastern territories were seen as the answer. In Berlin's calculations, controlling land meant controlling the future. Agriculture would support occupation. Industry would power expansion. Resources would sustain empire. The invasion of the East was therefore not only ideological, it was economic strategy. A war for land was also a war for survival, at least in the regime's view. The Treaty of Versailles had drawn the map of post-war Europe. For Hitler, that map was illegitimate. It symbolized defeat, humiliation, constraint. Reversing Versailles became both political promise and strategic necessity. The first step was psychological. Germany rejected the moral guilt imposed upon it. Nationalist rhetoric reframed the treaty as unjust punishment. Then came action. Rearmament defied military restrictions. The Rhineland was remilitarized. Austria was absorbed. Each move chipped away at the post-1919 order. The Sudetenland followed. Then Czechoslovakia itself. These were not random expansions. They were systematic dismantling. The Versailles boundaries were not erased in one stroke. They were undone piece by piece. Every successful gamble strengthened the regime's confidence. Every hesitant response from Britain and France confirmed a dangerous lesson. The old order would not defend itself. The destruction of Versailles was more than territorial revision. It was the collapse of a peace settlement. By 1939, the framework designed to prevent another war had already disintegrated. Europe was no longer living under the treaty's map. It was living in its ruins. And in those ruins, a new and far more violent map was being prepared. Ideology defined the objective. The military would define the method. By the mid-1930s, Germany's expansionist vision was no longer abstract rhetoric. It was translated into operational planning. The eastern frontier became a focus of strategic study. Rail lines were mapped. Road capacity was measured. Bridges were evaluated for armored weight. Logistics came first. An invasion of the East would require speed. It would require coordination between infantry, armor, and air power. The concept of rapid, concentrated assault began to take shape. Short campaigns, decisive breakthroughs, encirclement of enemy forces. Military exercises simulated border engagements. Staff officers calculated mobilization timelines. War games tested different scenarios. Poland, geographically exposed and strategically isolated, became the immediate case study. Beyond Poland lay a much larger challenge. The vast territories of the Soviet Union demanded long-term planning. Distance was both obstacle and opportunity. Success in the East would require not only force, but organization. Supplies would need to move quickly across expanding fronts. Fuel would determine momentum. Rail conversion would shape the pace of advance. By the late 1930s, the Eastern Campaign was no longer theoretical. It was embedded in doctrine. Expansion would not be improvised. It would be executed with precision. The planning rooms were quiet. The calculations were clinical. But the implications were immense. The Eastern question had moved from ideology to inevitability. Expansion required more than armies. It required belief. The Nazi regime understood that war could not begin on the battlefield alone. It had to begin in the mind. Through speeches, newspapers, posters, radio broadcasts, and mass rallies, expansion was reframed as destiny. Lebensraum was not presented as conquest, it was presented as necessity. Propaganda simplified complex geopolitics into emotional narratives. Germany was surrounded. Germany was threatened. Germany deserved justice. Repetition was key. The same themes echoed again and again. National pride, economic survival, historical correction. Children learned these ideas in classrooms. Youth organizations reinforced them, films dramatized them. The regime carefully crafted imagery, strong leaders, disciplined soldiers, united crowds. The message was clear. Expansion was not aggression. It was restoration. Opposition voices were silenced. Independent media disappeared. Alternative perspectives faded from public view. As years passed, the line between ideology and reality blurred. Many citizens accepted expansion as logical. Some embraced it enthusiastically. Others remained silent. Propaganda did not eliminate doubt entirely, but it reshaped the national conversation. By the late 1930s, the population had been prepared psychologically. When borders shifted, it felt inevitable. When armies moved, it felt justified. The Eastern Campaign would require sacrifice. Propaganda ensured that sacrifice would appear meaningful. War would not be sold as destruction. It would be sold as destiny fulfilled. Expansion did not happen overnight. It was staged. Hitler understood something crucial about his opponents. They feared war more than they feared him. So he moved carefully. Each demand was framed as limited. Each objective described as final. Each agreement presented as compromise. Diplomacy became a weapon. At Munich, assurances were given, promises were made, documents were signed. Behind closed doors, calculations continued. The strategy was simple: advance, pause, reassure, advance again. By presenting himself as a rational statesman, Hitler bought time. Time to rearm, time to consolidate territory, time to test the resolve of Britain and France. Publicly, he spoke of peace. Privately, he prepared for war. Diplomatic channels were used not to avoid conflict, but to delay resistance. Each successful bluff strengthened his position. Each hesitation from Western powers reinforced a dangerous perception. They would not act decisively. Tactical patience became strategic advantage. The annexation of Austria was justified as self-determination. The Sudetenland framed as ethnic correction. The occupation of Czechoslovakia described as stabilization. Every step blurred the line between legality and aggression. Europe responded with protest, but not force. And in that gap between words and action, Germany grew stronger. Diplomatic deception was not a side strategy. It was central. War would come, but only when the conditions were optimal. Territory was not the end goal. It was the beginning. Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond revising borders or reclaiming lost lands. His objective was dominance. Not temporary military advantage, but structural control over Europe. In his vision, Germany would stand at the center of a reorganized continent. Western Europe would be subordinated, Eastern Europe transformed, resources centralized under German authority. Political independence would become conditional. Economies would be aligned with Berlin's interests. Infrastructure reshaped to serve imperial logistics. The eastern territories were intended as settlement zones. German families would relocate. Agricultural production would be redirected. Urban centers redesigned. This was not traditional empire in the colonial sense. It was continental hegemony. The new order envisioned a Europe structured by hierarchy. Core territories at the center, subordinate states at the periphery. Labor and resources flowing inward. Long-term planning documents projected decades ahead. Population engineering, industrial corridors, military strongpoints. War was the mechanism. Empire was the objective. By the late 1930s, this vision was embedded in leadership thinking. Expansion was not impulsive. It followed ideological conviction and strategic design. the Eastern Campaign would be the decisive step. Once secured, the balance of power in Europe would be permanently altered. Germany would not merely influence Europe, it would control it. The road to September 1939 was therefore not accidental. It was deliberate. A continental empire required war. And war was approaching.